Hello, everyone. It's time to talk about the First Law world, overarching story universe by Joe Abercrombie. I just finished the Wisdom of Crowds, the last book in this First Law universe as of now, and I just need to talk about this. So this will be a bit rambly. I have a couple of notes, but yeah, I'm sorry if this is all over the place, but I just need to um, say my thoughts, and I will have like two sections. The first part is going to be no non spoilery, and then the last part I just want to share some things with spoilers, so I will mark that later. And basically, I want to make this video for people that are interested about reading this but want to know like if it's worth it, like do I need to read the standalones, like is it worth reading the second trilogy, all of those questions. And I want to give I think some original thoughts, or like some of my, I guess, hot takes with things that I think I have a different opinion uh, compared to what I normally see in conversations around these stories. I think if you clicked on this video, you know more or less what the First Law world is. That it's made up of like a trilogy, and then a trilogy of standalones, and then a second trilogy that is kind of a generational jump between the first trilogy. So you follow some of the children of a couple of characters from the first trilogy. So I think you probably have heard of that. You have probably heard that the characters are amazing. So I will not explain these so much, because I think a lot of people have talked about it, and if you clicked on this video, you probably know more or less the gist of it. So let's just jump into it. I started the first trilogy a couple of years ago, and just for some context, this was one of the first kind of modern series that I read, as far as I can tell, and honestly, it blew my mind. Like I cannot under say how new, how mind blowing this first trilogy felt for me, because I had never read anything like this before. The biggest strength of the first trilogy is this ensemble of characters, and how they are always interacting with each other and clashing, not necessarily like physically, but how they, you know, bounce around ideas, and how they, like, their dialogues are just so cool. And I think this is, and again, thinking about like who this story is for, this is definitely a more traditional fantasy series, in that it is a bit more like the setting is a bit more like Middle Times ish. The base of the, or like the center of the story, like the I would say the main city, Adwa, is also very like Euro. It's like Western European inspired, I would say. So in that sense, it feels a lot more like a traditional fantasy story. You have this kind of overarching adventure. There's even a quest, and so there are other like traditional elements about the story. And I think the other one is that while it's true that characters in the first law are always gray, there's no one that's like purely good. There are some like purely evil characters, I would say, or like mostly evil characters, but for the most part, characters in this world are very complex, very three dimensional, with flaws and qualities. And that being said, I do think the first trilogy has more lovable characters. I think while there are a couple of, let's just call them like external like villains, I would say there's kind of this invasion from the north, this invasion from the south, and these are in the story portrayed a bit more like the enemies, or like the bad guys. And you don't really have perspectives from these two powers. You kind of see them from the side of the good guys. um, so you have this more like division between the good and the bad, even though again like everyone is pretty gray and even the good characters are awful and have very irredeemable qualities sometimes. But again, I do think there is this kind of overarching like, we're like, these people are like the good ones, are you rooting for them, you want them to win, they are the like the evil side. Now let's jump into what I would say is the biggest problem with this trilogy, and that is its critically low amount of female characters. I think that the ones that are there are pretty good. Like I do think that the female characters that we get in this trilogy are for the most part are great. Thinking about Pharaoh and thinking about Ardi, but there are too few of them. I think I don't know why we didn't get a more diverse cast of characters in that sense. And there's honestly not much else to say about that. Like that I think is a critical flaw of the first trilogy. Now, the other thing that I want to address is that you will hear a lot that the story has no plot. And I think that is very false. Again, I think it depends a bit where you come from. I had not been kind of keeping up with the modern fantasy releases during my university years. So for me, reading the first law was like eye opening. And so I think, depending what your background is, I don't know if you just come from reading like the Cosmere, which is, I mean, I haven't read it, but from what I understand, a very plot driven story, or like just Sanderson books in general. If you come from that and you're thinking that this is like something you read for the plot, then I can understand why that would be disappointing. But I would not go as far as saying that the first law, the first trilogy at least, has no plots, because I think it's actually very fun. It's very exciting, and it's mostly because of this kind of group of people or this unlikely team that is formed and kind of their adventure, which again very traditional kind of plot or narrative framework. But I think the plot is amazing, and also while there is not a lot of magic, this is not a very kind of magic heavy world building story. I think there is a lot of fantastical elements that just make the story very whimsical, and a lot of that comes actually through the northern part of the world. And I will get a bit into this, um, yeah, in the kind of more spoilery part later. But I do think the first trilogy feels more magical, feels more whimsical, because I think there are you get to see the north, I think, more closely. um, so again, the magic is very low. I think it's if you would wanted to categorize it, it's more like a soft magic in the world. But I think it brings a lot of like charm and like mysteriousness as well. There is kind of this ancient lore that is playing a role in the story, like throughout the trilogy, which comes together, I think, very very interestingly. Even though I would love to learn more about the history of this world, but yeah, I think the magic is low, but I think it's very, it just makes it very special. I think, especially when you're in the north. Um, so I think that kind of wraps up what I wanted to share about the first trilogy. So let's just jump into the standalones. So you have the what is it, Best Served Cold, then the Heroes, and then Red Country. And I think the question that everyone asks is, should I read these books, right? Do I need to read them to read the second trilogy? And obviously, as with anyone who probably has answered this, I think the question is, it depends. I, for the longest part, would have said that, like, yes, like they're amazing, and I wanted to read them because I knew they would kind of set up the world, which kind of was needed for the second trilogy. Now, after I have read the third trilogy, I would say, honestly, they are not so important. Like, I don't think they are so critical as I thought before. I knew that Abercrombie wanted to write these standalones more to experiment with different genres, because you have this kind of revenge story that it feels very kind of murder mystery, or like not a mystery, but yeah, it's just like a very different like kind of plot, boom 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 story. And then you have like this war novel, and then the old western. So I knew for sure that Abercrombie wanted to play with different genres, but I still kind of expected them to play a an important role in the story. And unfortunately, like now that I've read the Age of Madness, I can say that they're not as important, at least as of now, at least as of this 2025, where where the story is in the first law. Maybe more stories will come later in this world, and the standalones will play a bigger role. But I honestly feel like, unless you really want to learn more about the different parts of the world for kind of for fun, I think you can fairly like safely jump straight into the second trilogy. That is kind of my hot take there. If you want my opinion, like the second book, The Heroes, is the best. I know that Best Served Cold is also one of the kind of most loved stories in this universe, and I think that it wasn't that good. I thought it was very repetitive, and it was just kind of jumping from one city to the next, and like um, yeah, like the revenge story there, I think felt for a bit repetitive. I think The Heroes was amazing, both because like the premise, you have this like war that happens over 2 3 days, and so the entire book just follows people on different parts of this war, like geographically, because it's not like a very spatially spaced out war, but you have people like spread out in different sections of these around this hill of stones, and you flip between different sides, and you go into perspectives of like generals and soldiers on kind of boots on the ground. And so I think this is where I started seeing Abercrombie play a lot more with like the narrative, like the POVs, and just like his writing. I think this is where it started like becoming a much tighter, um, really really good. And I would say also like luckily, this is in my opinion again the best of the standalones, and I think it's the one that matters the most in terms of the third, like the second trilogy, the Age of Madness. So if there is one standalone that you want to read or you're like kind of interested, I would definitely say The Heroes, because it sets up uh, the largest amount of characters that are important in Age of Madness that come from the standalones are all in The Heroes. So I would honestly just read that. Um, I think, and this is maybe another unpopular opinion, but there is this character called Shivers that I think everyone loves, and he is kind of the connecting thread across the three standalones. So you could say that he's kind of the protagonist, even though he's not the protagonist in any of them. Well, kind of in Best Served Cold, but he's just a recurring character in the three books. Um, and I actually don't think his character is that interesting. I think there are other characters that have a much more interesting arc. I think he has a lot of echoes to Logan Nine Fingers, and I even remember when I read First Serve Cold, I was thinking like, wait, is this just like Logan 2.0? Like, why do people love this guy? And I will say like his appearances in Age of Madness are amazing. Like I do really really love his relationship with one of the other characters. So I don't want to like say more than that, but I think a lot of his characterization happens actually off page. Like the way he is in Best of Cold to the Heroes doesn't change so much, and then you kind of he has an interesting moment in Red Country, and then you have like this time skip to the Age of Madness. So you actually don't really see him grow so much. I mean, he again like I think these are an interesting character, but I don't think he's nearly as interesting as I think people claim him to be. But again, most of the characters that appear in the standalones are secondary at best in the Age of Madness, if not like just minor characters. So honestly, as of now, hot take, but I think you can jump them. I actually really liked the Heroes, and even Best of Cold was fine. But I understand why it could be a challenge to have to read like to feel that you have to read three more books after the first trilogy to jump into the second one. Like honestly, if you just wanna like keep up the momentum and you just want to see like where the story goes and you don't need to have like all the Easter eggs, like just skip them. Like just jump into the second trilogy, Age of Madness, and you'll be perfectly fine. Now it's time to chat about the second trilogy, The Age of Madness. And as I said, there is a generational jump between the first and the second trilogy. So this happens, I think, 30 years after the events of the First Law trilogy, I want to say. And this story is very different. Like, this is a very different project than the first trilogy, which is, I think, very interesting and cool. So let's just kind of discuss like those differences. So I would say the first biggest difference is that while the first trilogy is kind of more expansive in its kind of setting and like where characters come from. I think it's way more spread out. Like you visit a lot of different cities from different kind of factions, even. Uh, so there is this kind of expansiveness in the first trilogy. Age of Madness, in comparison, I think is very very small in scale. It mostly happens around one city, Adwa, which is the kind of the capital of this kind of central empire, and I think that like right off the gate has a very different feel in terms of the adventureness of the story. Obviously, the second trilogy has way less of that, and the setting is also a bit more like indoors, like physically, like in buildings, and so I think there is a lot more of like political kind of conversations, kind of discussions, negotiations, like trials. There's even like a bit of like courtroom feeling to it. So while the first trilogy I think has more of this like exterior like nature, you are a lot of time just like in forests waiting for stuff, or I mean obviously the wars, or the traveling during the quest part of it. The second trilogy is a lot more kind of indoors, which I think was a very different kind of feeling, and it actually threw me off a bit because again I loved the first one for its kind of adventureness and magic. So that is definitely the first one. The second big I think comparison is that the Age of Madness is way less magical, way less whimsical. I think a lot of people describe this series as like uh, kind of magic is fading in the first trilogy, and then in the second trilogy, Age of Madness, the magic is almost like completely gone. This is something you will hear a lot in like booktube conversations, and it's definitely gone from the page. Like I completely agree, and mostly again, well, wait a sec. It is for sure gone from the page. You get a lot less fantastical elements, to the point where, again, hot take, but I would say this is a historical, like speculative historical fiction. I think like this has almost no fantasy, to the point where I would call this like historical fiction with fantastical elements rather than fantasy. I mean, I know people already complained, I think, from the first trilogy that it had not enough. It didn't have enough fantasy. Like, how is that even like fantasy? Second trilogy, like I can't even defend that. Like that is historical, like speculative fiction with some fantastical elements, which I loved. Like again, I am so like sad that there is so little magic left in this world, or at least on page, because I think it's super cool. I think the magic that Abercrombie creates, while not super complicated, I think is very very intriguing, and like I think it comes through the page beautifully with how he writes it in its kind of mysteries and like power, and it's almost like arcane but very simple. I love it. So Age of Madness, very very low fantasy, and I think that has to. I think that it comes mostly from the fact that, and this is the third kind of big difference, the cast of characters felt very like just as the first one I think was very diverse, with like almost had like one character from each place, and they all had completely different backgrounds. The characters from the second trilogy kind of all come from more or less the same places. I know people will come and say like, yeah, Rikke comes from like the north, and even Leo kind of grew up in the north, but like his family is from Adwa, and most of the people you follow are like from and in Adwa, this main city. So I feel like the kind of ideological difference that comes through, you know, where you come from, that was I think missing a lot in the second trilogy. Not to say that that is kind of a problem, but that is something that I kind of missed. So just so you know, I think there is a lot less of that. Not to say that the characters feel the same, because the characters in the second trilogy are very distinct, and I would say even more complex and more like, how can I say it? I think they are even more three-dimensional, like fourth dimensional, than the first one, the first trilogy. I think their conflicts, like their internal conflicts, are a bit more complex. Their even character arcs are, I think, more complicated. and the kind of internal and external conflicts are all more complicated. So I would say, like, in general, the cast of characters in the Age of Madness is more complex, and I think that is very cool because there is, I think, more to kind of discuss and like dissect about these characters. So I definitely think that is a strength of the cast. And the fourth like big difference that I want to point out is the tone of the story. I think the Age of Madness feels a lot darker. It's more serious. I'm not sure if that has to do with the fact that our own world is kind of a mess. Not that it wasn't like in 2020, but I don't know. Like I personally feel like while the first trilogy was kind of more humorous, a bit lighter in its tone, I think the second one is a lot more depressing. It's way darker with some of the things that happen. Um, so just be advised. I think there is a like important tonal shift. I know that there are like it's Abercrombie, right? So the Age of Madness has some hilarious moments, and like some of the best moments in the entire trilogy in terms of like how funny they were are in this second trilogy. But I think I did not laugh like nearly as much as I did in the first trilogy. Obviously, humor can like be very different between like different people how you perceive it. So maybe some readers thought this was like hilarious. I personally felt like it was a lot more serious. It was like darker. I think the dark like the shades of evilness that we reach in this second trilogy are like darker than in the first one. um yeah, and even like the characters themselves, like even the main casts, as amazing as they are and like as much as we cheer for them, I think they are harder to love and root for. uh, I think we still get attached to them because they are so complex and like interesting, and you want kind of all of them to well, not all of them, but you want some of them to do good. But I think it's harder to like to feel attached to them, except for one, which is Orso. We'll get to that in the spoiler section. From my experience, the biggest downfall of the Age of Madness in my own reading experience was not knowing that this is not a, in my opinion, a conclusion to the first law kind of overarching storyline or universe. I was expecting the wisdom of crowds to kind of putting everything together from especially from like the standalones and some of the things that were opened up in the first trilogy. And unfortunately, I feel like that was missing. Now that I think is a partly like majorly a thing about expectations. I think the way it wraps up the internal conflict of the trilogy was amazing. Like I think if you just focus on the things that were kind of set up in this Age of Madness trilogy, then I think that project is very well put together. I think it's very exciting, very kind of explosive, and yeah, very like anger inducing, but amazing. So like I do want to say like the project of Age of Madness I think is great. Now the problem is that I was like thinking that Age of Madness was the last book in First Law kind of ever, right? I knew that Joe Abercrombie is now working on this Devil's trilogy. I don't know if he has any plans to work more stories in here, but I was just a bit frustrated and honestly disappointed that a lot of the things that I even had like great theories, I think, with how like some of the my theories from like the first trilogy and some of the open-ended questions were going to like come like open like crashing to the door of the second trilogy, also from the standalones. I will talk about these in the spoilery section, but for you like in this non-spoilery part, I do want to say that that was kind of a disappointment, especially because the second book, The Troll with Peace, actually starts connecting a bit with the standalone. So I even remember writing to my friend and saying like, you know what, like never mind, like I had said that you could just like read a summary of the standalones. Like honestly, you need to read them. Like in the second book, The Trouble with Peace, uh, I was like starting to see how these standalones were like coming together and like would play a major part. And so when I was reading that, I was like, honestly, never mind. Like ignore me. You actually need to read the standalones. Like we're like setting up something amazing, and like this will come together in Wisdom of Crowds, and it didn't like at all. I felt honestly a bit cheated with how like some of the like characters from the standalones were kind of name drop or have like one scene in the Troll with Peace, hinting, in my opinion, about like this more like overarching conflict that I thought would be what the Wisdom of Crowds would like be about, and instead they kind of just had like their scene and like nothing comes out of it. So I think expectation management. I would say like don't read the Age of Madness thinking that it's like the last thing, because honestly with how it ends, and like I think there's a bomb drop at the end, which I don't know how that could be like the end of this. Like this feels so open to me as a world, right? Like again, very clear, like the Age of Madness, whatever is set up in the story is like concluded, and I think that was amazing. But if you think about like the entire First Law universe, like there's no way that could be the end. um, and yeah, so I think maybe if there are more books written later, the standalones, I think my opinion about reading the standalones will change. I think if those other like cities and continents come together like in more of a larger scale conflict or like story, then for sure read them. But as of now, if this is the end, like you can, I think unless you're like like love his writing, love his characters, and just want to get whatever you can, if you only care about like following like the main story, like I think you can skip them. So the other thing that I will say, and I will try to like say as little about this as possible, but I am actually very angry with the queer representation in the Age of Madness. It's something that it's not discussed, I feel like, at all, almost, um, which is a bit like maddening. But there is one of the main characters is queer, and how do we actually, let's just it's very hard to say because I will need to give out spoilers, so I will talk more of that in the spoiler section. But I am not happy with the representation that we got from this queer character, because it's basically the only main character in the entire First Law world that is queer, and his queerness, I think I just did not like how it was explored. So the fact that he's the only main character, I think gives a bitter taste in my mouth. Obviously, it's Abercrombie. Like no one is perfect. I was not expecting like a perfect character and like or like the queer character to be like perfect and flawless. Like that's not what I'm saying. I just feel like if you're going to have such a flawed queer character and it's your only like main queer character, I think it would have been interesting and very easy to have a bit more queerness in the character, to have a bit more like dimensional dimensionality to how queerness can be in this world. And so I will talk more about that because I think it would have been very easy to incorporate in the story. But yeah, that is basically the non-spoiler conversation. Yeah, so so now let's get into the spoilers. This is your last warning. Spoilers in three, two, one. Now there's spoilers. So, uh, yeah, I think the biggest thing for me, as I just mentioned, is the fact that this does not feel like an ending. Like what happened with like Styria and like the Eaters and like the House of the Maker and Pharaoh, which who is like still trapped in like the seed. All of these things that happened in the first trilogy, I was like, what happened with all of that? Even like Shenk, I think has a like shows up in Troll of Peace. So I think it was kind of not nice how the Troll with Peace hints, I think, about this kind of overarching thing, and then like nothing happens out of that. Like Vitari and even Japo, I think, appears in maybe the A Little Hatred. So I like my prediction. Like this is where I think we can get into some like predictions, because I thought where like the story would go when I was first reading like A Little Hatred was that maybe like Leo and what's his name, Sour Nightfall, this guy, like they would need to like unite against like an external enemy. Like I was just thinking this would be a conflict between like the Union and the North finally together against maybe Styria, and like we would have Murkato and Japo and like all of ones from the Berserk Cult book like clashing together or something. I think that was kind of what I was expecting, and I mean, it doesn't matter that my prediction was wrong, but I hope that comes like later. um, so that was that. I like even like things from the first trilogy, like the House of the Maker. I was when I remember reading the Wisdom of Crowds, and when I think it's Judge who starts saying that we're going to like throw people off the tower. Honest, also that part, like I think First Law had never gotten that dark. Like throwing people off that tower was, and I've read like Malas, and I've read like really like the Black Leopard, Red Wolf, like some really dark stuff, but that was really tough. But anyways, when I was reading that, I was like, this is when they will uh, like my prediction was that they would like open the House of the Maker to like go up the stairs and throw people off the House of the Maker, and that would be like the moment where like Pharaoh comes out, or like the seed. I don't even remember what happens with the seed after Bias uses it to kind of destroy everything, but I don't know. I thought like I was like yes, like that's when like the House of Maker comes in. They will like open it without like maybe like in Judge's mind it would have been like who cares about like history? Like that's just like a tower. Like who is this like magician that was like I don't even know if it's common knowledge that like there's people inside. But in this idea of like not paying respect to the past or like to the magic of the world, if they would have been like, I just open the tower, like we'll just go up the stairs and like throw people, and Pharaoh would be like, hello. uh, I would have loved seeing that. Yeah, but that was not the story that Abercrombie wanted to tell, which is fine. Um, so yeah, all of that, I was honestly disappointed. Let's just move to some other things. Um, yeah, like I had a prediction around downside and or like let's bring it together. I thought I was so smart because I was like downside. He is Logan Nine Fingers. There is no way this guy is not like Logan Nine Fingers. I might have missed something about like his background. I don't know, but like I feel like the moment he came to the page, I think it was maybe in A Little Hatred or A Troll with Peace. I was like, I'm calling it. I'm calling that this guy is Logan Nine Fingers, and when it happens, I'm gonna be like feel so smart. And I feel like there were so many instances where like that made so much sense. And I don't know if it was just me trying to like feed my own theory and like seeing what was not there. I don't know if that was the case, but I think his brutality and like his bloodthirstiness was so like it was like it would have been perfect. Especially because in the what's it, the Wisdom of Crowds, when they Stour or like Black Calder and like this army is going to fight with Rike, like in that confrontation where Shivers is also there, I was like, this is a moment where Shivers and Logan are gonna fight. Like, screw what happened in Red Country. Like, he forgave him there, but then like Logan came back or something. Like, I was so ready for that reveal, and I would have been like, I called it from page one, and then like Downside died, and I was like, screw this. Like, I was wrong. But it would have been a great theory. Like, hasn't I. I don't know if I'm alone with this. I have not heard anyone else talk about this, but this is my like I would have loved seeing that. Not even like and I think I mean Joe Abercrombie makes people change names sometimes, uh, and he plays a bit with that. And so I think it would have played greatly having like Logan as a minor character, being Logan all over again, but also like not fan service like because if he's called Downside and he's just like bloody like maybe it's not like on your face. I would have loved seeing that honestly, like a confrontation there. I mean I don't know. I think if the last thing we see of Logan Nine Fingers is Red Country, honestly, that's kind of sad because I mean the end scene was kind of nice, but I don't know. Downside had to be Logan. The other theory that I was kind of very sure about was Suri being an eater, and I was happy that I got that right. So that happened. That was kind of cool. Uh, and yeah, what else? Bias. What, like, where the heck is Bias? Mm, I don't know how people are talking about like discussing Bias being absent in the story. I don't know if it's a matter with like the magic is fading and he's maybe not that powerful. I think the only thing actually that I heard in a couple of discussions was like, Bias is like a politician now, so he cannot just like come in guns blazing and like destroy everything again. And I actually don't agree with it. Like, yeah, like a couple people know him in like the high circles of like society and the royalty, but I think most people don't even know him, and I don't think he's a politician. Like, he's not that public. He comes like on and off here and there, and like a lot of people usually don't recognize him. So I don't think that that explanation makes sense. I mean, we have heard that he's been like away, like in this far country. So maybe he was just like, yeah. I mean, I know the story happens like in a couple, like, but it's also a year. Like, it's I if the whole wisdom, no, sorry, the Age of Madness had happened like in a week or something, I would have understood the explanation that Bias was like far away and didn't have time to react. But this happens like under a year or something. So I don't know. I actually kind of felt, and I mean, Bias does come to like a couple times, and he's actually in the north because he talks with Rike. So he was kind of around. Like, I don't know, maybe he's just not as powerful as people think. Like, could it be that Bias is kind of a hoax? Um, that is kind of the only explanation that I can give to this, because I think it was a bit unrealistic or not so easy to believe that he would just like let everything happen, or maybe it's just part of his master plan. I don't know, but I would have loved seeing a bit more of like Bias is up to something. Um, but anyways, I need to talk about the queer representation of Leo, because I also don't feel like this is talked enough in conversations about the Age of Madness. I call like I think, as probably a lot of people, like the almost the first scene where he's introduced, he's like like discussing, he's like with his this group of friends, and like he's, or like he describes them, I think, in, and then with one of them in particular, he's like, oh, he's so beautiful. And I think it was kind of obvious from there, and just continually on, that he was kind of attracted to this guy. And I was really excited to have more like on the page and more like forward, or like, yeah, queerness, because even though in the first trilogy we obviously have Queen Therese, who was also played kind of dirty, I think, with her queerness in that story. But anyways, um, I was like, yes, this is like Abercrombie, I think, heard the critics, and like we have like female characters. Now we're also gonna get queer characters. Like, let's go. And I mean, I didn't. Let me be clear. I was not expecting, or didn't need it to be like a story about queerness, or it didn't have to be like on your face like all the time. I was just excited to see like a queer character more on the page, and see what that could be like in the first law. And honestly, I am a bit sad that like it had to be Leo, because he is despicable. He turns into a monster, and it's so tragic. And I was actually kind of shocked in the third book, because when, I mean, during A Troll of Peace, it's like, okay, he had this kind of ambition, uh, and his own kind of power hunger drove him to this, to do this revolution, and it kind of all fell on top of himself. And I thought he would have kind of learned from that, and we, I think, started to be a bit empathetic towards him, and he was kind of learning. And I was very shocked in the third book, and as I think especially in like in the last 100 pages, he just takes like a turn, and that shocked me. Like, I at first I was like, whoa, are we supposed to feel like, I always felt a bit sus about him, because he has been racist from page one. Like, he, every time there's people from uh like Gurkish people, which are like in the south, from the south, with like darker skin, he always makes a comment about like, ah, the brown people. So he's always been a freaking effing racist. So I've always been like a bit against him because of that. And I mean, I think he's always been childish. So he's never like a character that I was like rooting for. But I think in A Trouble with Peace, I started to see like where his kind of growth could come from, and how he could kind of become a leader, maybe, or even like after all, the flop of his revolution, I don't know, do something for good instead. So I like, oh, Abercrombie pulled the rug out of my feet in in the Wisdom of Crowds, because I genuinely thought like we were supposed to kind of root for him, and yeah, he becomes this monster. But anyways, going back to where I wanted to say, I am kind of sad that he is like the one queer character that we have like in the main cast, with how dark his story goes. And as I said in the first part of the video, I was not expecting like the queer character to come unscathed. I mean, it's the first love, it's Abercrombie after all. But like, does it have like, does the tragic kind of queer story need to be like that's the only main representation we have in the first law? I think we can do better than that. And especially, and this is where I like, I think hinted at it, but I think Teufel, I don't know how to say her name, but the agent, I think, for instance, she could have been another queer character very easily, right? Like, and I think her story is amazing. I think her portrayal of like how extreme loyalty can take you from like the worst of the worst to even like the best of the best, and or maybe not so best, but I think she's amazing. I loved her. And I think she, for instance, could have been another character that had like very casual kind of queerness, and maybe she just had like, I don't know, we could have had like a sapphic story maybe, and she could have had like lovers here and there or something. Like, it doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't have to be like a perfect like wholesome queer story in first love. Like, I was not expecting that, but I think it would have been nice to have a balance between like queer characters being like the absolute worst crap in the story, Leo, and something a bit more redeemable, someone that's like a bit better, a bit like less evil or less tragic. Like, we've had so many tragic queer stories since forever, and I was a bit disappointed that we didn't get uh, something else out of it. Like, it felt, yeah, it felt a bit poor, I think. Um, and even Duran, like, because you could see like, we have other like queer characters like Duran, and he's obviously like a great person. He's super smart. He's always like loyal to his friends, like good qualities. But even at the end, I feel like he's um, almost like affection and addiction to Leo, and also his own like ambition turned him into not a great guy. Like, because I was thinking, okay, even now that Leo is like a piece of trash, like maybe Durant and like that relationship developing could be something that kind of helps him, like kind of reel him back into reality and like towards the good of things. But like, Durant kind of just becomes his pawn, and just does whatever Leo wants. And even like in one of the last scenes when they are discussing in the council, and he wants to like invade, like for whatever reason, and I think there's uh like a line with like saying that Duran, even he was like thinking about it, because he's always like reasoning things. He's like the like logical. He doesn't rush into things hot headed, and then when it comes to the voting, he supports Leo, and it's like, you obviously thought that this was a bad idea. Like, why are you supporting him just because? Like, maybe I'm a bit biased and I'm being a bit too harsh on it, but because it is the one like representation of queerness that is a bit like more, it's the one main character, I guess, that is queer. um I think I was holding uh or we should be holding authors to I think a bigger like a better standard, I think. But yeah, I think everything that I had to say right now. I don't know if this is kind of a reading guide or just like a vomit of ideas, or like my like immediate thoughts after finishing the story. But I hope this can give you some more information about like whether or not to read these books. I hope this is helpful. and have a wonderful rest of the week. Let me know if you have read this, if you are planning to read the first law, or if you agree or disagree with any of these. So please just keep it spoiler free in the comments if you write something, because we don't want to spoil anything for anyone. Yeah, thank you. Have a great day. Bye bye.